Alright guys, we are here. We are in the week of No Way Home releasing in theaters. This is insane. So let's just finish off our Spider-Man reviews. We're going to jump on over to the MCU and we're going to talk about Spider-Man Homecoming. But before we get to Spider-Man Homecoming, let me take you guys on a trip back to 2016 to this small little movie called Captain America Civil War. Because ultimately being connected to the MCU, this is where Peter Parker actually makes his debut, and this is where we meet Tom Holland for the first time as Spider-Man. Now let me just say for myself, the moment that Tom Holland popped onto the screen in Civil War, he was immediately Peter Parker and Spider-Man to me. He just captured the character so well with the small little scenes and dialogue that he had in Civil War. When he's sitting down with Tony Stark in his bedroom and Tony asks him why he does what he does, and he vaguely explains why he does what he does, because when you can do the things that he can and you don't, and then the bad things happen, they're on you. He's obviously talking about Uncle Ben, so we never really see Uncle Ben die. We never really get to see this Spider-Man's origin story in the MCU, but the way that the MCU portrays Peter really works. I love how they show off the genius of Peter in Civil War. He's a dumpster driver looking for scrap electronic parts so that he can build his own computers. And once you get to the airport battle, and you see Tom Holland Spider-Man fighting alongside all the rest of the Avengers, it was such a great welcome to Spider-Man in the MCU, and it helped me to instantly buy Tom Holland as our new Spider-Man. But in Spider-Man Homecoming, this is when Tom Holland really steps into his own Peter Parker. I feel that they successfully did what they tried to do with Andrew Garfield in The Amazing Spider-Man, and that is bring Peter Parker into the modern age. Because nerd culture has changed over the years. The bookworm and stereotypical nerd look and portrayal that Tobey gave in his films doesn't really work in the culture of today. But Tom Holland's Peter isn't picked on so much because he's a nerd. He's more so picked on because he outcasts himself from the rest of his peers by being Spider-Man. He's known as being the boring guy. He's bland. He kind of blends into the background. And you get the sense that he has a reputation of being a flake. A guy you can't really rely on because after school he's secretly going off and doing his Spider-Man stuff. And I really like the way that they play with this in the film because it's kind of an updated take on the consequences Peter has of being Spider-Man. By going off and fighting crime as Spider-Man after school, he's not building any connections and he's kind of introverting and outcasting himself from the rest of the school, and that's why he gets picked on and that's why he feels like he's at the bottom of the food chain. But that's what keeps the character so admirable to me. Like when he's at Liz's party and he's gonna swing in as Spider-Man and he's looking into the window at all of his classmates in there, and you can just see it on his face that he's like, no, this is not the responsible thing to do. This is not what Spider-Man is. And it's those little decisions and those moments that he misses out on in his life to be Spider-Man that I love so much about Tom Holland's Peter Parker. This is also the most realistic and realized high school Peter Parker story we've ever gotten on film. I love the high school environment in this movie. First off, everyone is a kid. Everyone at least looks like a kid. They don't look like they should have graduated 10 years ago. And the thing that I love most about Spider-Man Homecoming is that they really play this story as a coming-of-age story, and they take the coming-of-age story formula and apply it to Peter becoming Spider-Man. Because in this movie, Peter is a very young Spider-Man. When we first meet him in Civil War, he says he's only been doing the Spider-Man stuff for about 6 months, and this is 2 months after Civil War. So Peter hasn't even been Spider-Man for a full year yet. And in that way, he's kind of the quintessential friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. He hasn't taken on the big foes yet. He's just stopping people that might have stolen bikes or might be stealing cars or helping old ladies get directions across the street. And so after being with the Avengers and fighting alongside them and against them, once he gets back to his everyday normal life, you totally understand why Peter's so frustrated and wants to do more because this is no longer enough for him. And it makes Tom Holland's Peter just so easy to root for in this movie. And of course, Peter gets his wish once Adrian Toomes, played by Michael Keaton, enters the picture. And Adrian Toomes is one of the best fleshed out villains we've ever had in a Spider-Man movie. He's also one of the best fleshed out villains we've had in the MCU in general. Because they give him such a great motivation. He's just an everyday Joe. He has an ordinary job. Him and his crew were assigned to clean up the Tatari attack after the Avengers battle in New York, until Tony Stark comes in and sweeps that out from under his feet, almost costing him his livelihood. So with the Tatari tech that him and his crew were able to smuggle out of there, he's selling hybrid alien technology to the underground black market. And this is what helps him to be such a memorable villain to me, because you totally understand and have sympathy for what he's doing. Yeah, what he's doing is wrong. He shouldn't be selling weapons to the black market. You can almost get behind him because you do feel how just screwed over he got by Iron Man. They also add in a pretty unique relationship for Peter Parker with Peter and Ned, played by Jacob Batalon. I have to say, I think it was pretty risky of them to have Ned discover that Peter is Spider-Man so early on in this film. But I really like the friendship that they give Peter and Ned. It's something we haven't seen in a Spider-Man movie up until this point. Peter has always had romantic relationships that would eventually find out his secret identity, but he's never really had a friend who knew that he was Spider-Man. And it gives Peter someone to express his frustrations to, because when he feels these ambitions that he should be an adventurer, that he doesn't want to be just on the ground a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man anymore, Ned is there to kind of be the one that brings Peter back down to earth and be like, hey, you know, you're just a kid, man. Maybe you should just listen to Tony Stark. And because this is the third iteration of Spider-Man that we've gotten up until this point, it's a very fresh and new dynamic that they introduced into this film. This movie also has one of the best twists of any of the Spider-Man movies. Because all throughout this movie, Spider-Man and Vulture's conflict have mainly been on Peter's part. Peter is the one that kind of seeks out the Vulture and wants to stop him. The Vulture's just trying to mind his own business and stay as under the radar as he can. But all throughout this movie, Peter has a crush on a girl named Liz, and when he finally asks her out to go to the homecoming dance with her, he goes to pick her up at his house, and who opens the door but Adrian Toomes? And I remember when I first saw this movie in theaters, I gasped. In fact, the whole audience around me gasped, because we all thought, he's kidnapped Liz. He's found out that Peter's Spider-Man. How does he know this? But no, he's just Liz's dad. And it's such a brilliant twist because Spider-Man villains have always had a connection to Peter Parker's real life. And all throughout this movie, Spider-Man and the Vulture don't really have any real connections. But once he shakes Peter's hand and introduces himself as Liz's father, everything just kind of clicks into place. Because all throughout the movie, the Vulture has talked about having a wife and kids and having a family and a home. So once you look back on those scenes in the movie, you're like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, this makes perfect sense. And it's just a really smart and updated way to bring the trope of Peter Parker's personal life always interfering with his superhero life. It brings that concept into a more modern age. And Robert Downey Jr. is in this movie as Tony Stark. He's not in the movie very much, although Tony Stark does provide the one aspect of this movie that I'm not a big fan of, and that is the Spider-Man suit. Now, I don't hate the Spider-Man suit in this movie. It's not a deal breaker for me in any way, but by having all the Iron Man tech installed into it and having even an AI voice in Karen, kind of like how Iron Man has Jarvis, it just takes away something special in the Spider-Man character for me when he is in that Spider-Man suit. They make him feel too much like Iron Man in this movie. I definitely prefer a more classic suit, like we will eventually get in Far From Home. But as far as the suit goes in Homecoming, I could do without it, but it's not a big deal. It's just another way to give Peter that connection to Tony Stark when Robert Downey Jr. isn't on screen. And I know I kind of groaned and moaned about the way that the origin story is told in The Amazing Spider-Man, so I guess I should address the fact that there's no origin story for Peter Parker in this movie. And honestly, I don't really mind that too much because this movie is set in the MCU, and the MCU has established this world as being full of superhero people. So I can accept that Peter at some point got bit by the spider, his Uncle Ben died, and all of that stuff played out the way that we know it does. With great power comes great responsibility. You just have to fill in the gaps yourself because you've already seen this in 2 other series of Spider-Man films, so I guess I didn't want to repeat it for a 3rd time for audiences. And for me, they get the essence of the character so right that I don't really care that we don't see his origin story. Spider-Man Homecoming is one of the most unique Spider-Man movies out there. The coming-of-age story that they tell fits so well in the world of the MCU. Tom Holland is the first Peter Parker that's fully realized as being a kid. Even the way that he interacts with the foes in this movie, he just comes across as a good-hearted kid. And nowhere is this more displayed than when Adrian Toomes drops a building on him. It's almost disturbing to watch because Tom Holland sounds so distressed as he's calling out for someone to help him as he's stuck under all this rubble.
No! Please! Hey, please! I'm down here! I'm stuck! I'm stuck! I can't move! I can't...
I love that scene because in my mind, that's when Peter becomes Spider-Man as he's amping himself up. Come on, Spider-Man. And he's getting up and he's pushing the rubble off him. No Iron Man tech, no Karen, no Tony Stark to help him. Just full-on Spider-Man. In the end, guys, Spider-Man No Way Home is a delightful Spider-Man film. It's a great introduction to this character in the MCU and just a refreshing take on him in the movies in general. I love the lower scales. I love the John Hughes High School feel. And they've just done a great job updating the Spider-Man character for today. And for that reason, Spider-Man Homecoming gets a strong recommend from me. What do you guys think of Spider-Man Homecoming? Comment down below, let me know. I want to know all your thoughts and opinions about this movie. Guys, thank you again for clicking on this video and checking out my channel. And join me for another Spider-Man review. We are so close to Spider-Man No Way Home, so there's only one more movie to talk about. So come back in a couple days. I'll be talking about Spider-Man Far From Home. Until then, guys, if you like talking movies, TV, and all things entertainment, why don't you go on and click that subscribe button, click that like button, click that notification bell, all that YouTube stuff. And I hope to talk to you guys again real soon.